Hey everybody, my name is John Shutske. I am an Extension Agricultural Safety Specialist with the University of Wisconsin Extension, and I also have an appointment as a professor at UW-Madison in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. Today we're going to talk about farm stress, and I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about how the everyday stress that we face on a farm for some people can migrate into the notion of chronic stress. And what does that on-ramp look like of transitioning from acute stress to chronic stress? We're going to talk also a little bit about some of the negative outcomes associated with stress. In segments 2 and 3, we're going to talk about how stress affects our lives, how it affects our health, our relationships, and probably most importantly, how it affects decision making, which can be really difficult during these complicated times that we're facing in agriculture. In the final segment, we'll talk a little bit about the notion of control and some very specific things you can do to begin to break this cycle of stress and begin to regain a sense of control that is so important. First of all, what is stress? Everybody knows what stress is. I want to talk a little bit about some of the details and some of the technical aspects. When we see or hear something, we often take in information, threat information. I'm going to call it threat information. We take it in through one of our 5 senses. For example, we might hear a loud, startling noise, or we might get a phone call from a banker or a loan officer who may have some bad news to share with us. Or we might turn on the TV and see the most recent political move or some type of market information that is startling and creates a sense of panic or a sense of threat. Or we might pull back the blinds in our kitchen before we go to bed at night and see that we've got a barn or a building on fire. All of these things are perceived to us as threats, and our brains are wired to perceive the threats and to help us survive. When these threats occur, when the brain takes in this information, it triggers a series of events, and specifically, it creates a set of chemical releases. It's a little bit like yanking down on the throttle, the fuel throttle of a tractor or a piece of machinery, or stomping on the gas pedal, except instead of fuel, the chemicals that are released are the stress hormones and other chemicals that just flood our bodies. These hormones prepare us to either run away, or in many cases to turn around and try to fight off the threat, like running out to the building, calling 911, grabbing a fire extinguisher, trying to fight off the threat. Or in the worst case scenario, if the threat is severe and occurs often enough, we sometimes pull into a panic mode and become somewhat incapacitated. We know that this happens with soldiers and people who are in battle who are not well trained. So we know what these chemicals are. Everybody's heard about the chemical called adrenaline. The other one that's very common is cortisol, and cortisol is released from our adrenal glands during this process. What happens? The heart rate surges, your blood pressure goes up, and also your blood sugar elevates substantially. And all of this is the body's response to help you to fight off or run away from that threat. Lots of other things happen. Our muscles get tense. Our pupils dilate to be able to take in as much information as possible, and also our digestive system slows way down because that takes a lot of energy. The other thing that happens is the frontal part of our brain. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for thinking through information, making decisions. We often think of that frontal part of the brain as like a mental scratch pad. That part of the brain takes a back seat. It slows way down so that the other parts of the brain responsible for fear and anxiety and panic and things like that, that actually kind of takes over, and that frontal part of the brain begins to shut down. If this happens every once in a while, it's not a bad thing. In fact, stress is really crucial to our survival. Stress helps us grow. There's stress in being a child and going from second grade to third grade. There's stress associated with getting married, with having children, and with any type of change that you make on the farm. The problem is when that stress occurs often enough, it begins to cause problems. The good thing about our brain and this whole system that I talked about, the fuel, the throttle system, is that our brain also has little thermostats. In fact, we have thousands of little thermostats. Think of them as little pieces of Velcro in our brain. And these pieces of Velcro are receptors that grab onto this cortisol, and they tell the brain, okay, it's time to kind of chill out and cool down this stress response. It's a little bit like a furnace. A furnace kicks on, it puts heat energy into the air, and when the thermostat recognizes that the air is warm enough, it tells the furnace to shut down. Our brain acts exactly the same way. However, the problem is when you have this repeated series of threats, it's like voltage spikes in your brain. And also, you could think of it as like a constant pounding of waves on the ocean beach. In farming, those waves are the threats that we see with markets and weather and a lot of things that are really well beyond our control. However, what happens is in all this repeated stress with all of these repeated threats, the thermostat in the brain, these receptors, these little pieces of Velcro, they actually physically begin to wear out and they become far less effective. And so we have a difficult time then controlling the stress response. So when the brain thermostat becomes faulty, we begin to transition from acute short-term stress into longer-term chronic stress. What ends up happening is that frontal decision-making part of the brain becomes less effective, so we make worse decisions that have consequences, and again, this can become a vicious cycle. That's how short-term stress becomes chronic stress. In part 2, we'll talk a little bit about what does chronic stress really mean, what does it lead to, and what are some of the things you can begin to think about to control this long-term chronic stress.